Hi, everyone. We're so glad you can join us tonight as we begin Inclusive Education Month as our sort of pre-launch to that month where we celebrate all of the good things that inclusive education brings. That said, we do know that a lot of families across Canada are experiencing challenges, and we're hopefully here to provide some ideas and guidance. We have Lila Rafai joining us tonight from Arch Disability Law Center, and she's going to give us some guidance on how to advocate for our children. So I first heard about Lila about a year ago when the Brockville District Association for Community Involvement hosted her to do something similar to what we're doing tonight, where she spoke to families in my community in the area. And it really brought to my attention how many families are struggling with this, because just in our little part of Ontario, the numbers were quite high. So the work of Inclusive Education Canada and Inclusion Canada have been sort of sounding the alarm on this issue over the last year. So they've released a report called Pushed Out: The Harmful Effects of Partial Day Schooling, where we have some really specific stories from families' experiences and some data on what's going on across Canada. Also, Inclusion Saskatchewan, sorry, has used the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act to get specific data on the exclusion of students with disabilities from Saskatchewan school divisions. And through this research, they've uncovered that approximately 1,250 to 1,350 students labeled with intensive support needs were not allowed to attend school on a full-time basis in the 2024-2025 school year. So for Inclusive Education Canada, this is alarming. We do not accept the widespread denial of students' right to an education. By excluding students with disabilities from our neighborhood schools, whether it's through partial day schedules or outright full exclusion, we all lose. So students, obviously, they miss out. They're missing out on the wonderful learning opportunities that are at school. They miss out on learning with their peers. Um, and as a teacher of 26 years, a classroom teacher, I know that there are so many rewarding, enriching experiences that students who are excluded, whether partially or fully, are missing out on. And I also know from experience the benefits of inclusion for everyone. And so this is also an inclusion issue. Exclusion creates lasting academic and social harm. Exclusion not only harms the student, but it harms the school as well, because I think about the thousands of children and youth across Canada as we're learning over the past year or so, we're learning more concrete data on that issue. We learn that they're excluded from school, and I grieve for those missed opportunities and the potential for our schools and our communities. You know, we're missing out on those connections with the students who are excluded. It also it harms families, right? So obviously our priority is the education of the student, but we can't talk about this issue without discussing how it harms families. So this places enormous stress, whether it's the extra advocacy, the job stress, the employment stresses this creates, or financial disruption in the home because of loss of work or inability to work. These school exclusions are devastating for families. So schools need to be strengthened, families need help, and students need their education. So we're hoping this webinar tonight and our time with Lila will help us in this effort. So to introduce Lila, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to her because that's who we're here to hear from. Lila was called to the bar in 2012 and joined Arch Disability Law Center in July 2017 as a staff lawyer offering legal services related to disability rights for persons with disabilities across Ontario. Since 2019, she's the bilingual staff lawyer and student programs lead at Arch, providing legal assistance in both English and French. In addition to providing direct legal services to persons with disabilities, she also delivers public legal education and presentations to members of the legal profession and Arch's communities on a variety of topics. Throughout her legal career, Lila has appeared before several administrative tribunals, the Superior Court of Justice, and Divisional Court. So thank you, Lila, tonight for joining us. We're really excited to hear what you're going to share.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you everyone for inviting me. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint, and we could get started from there. Okay, great. So, as Andrew had given a brief introduction of the topic we are talking about today, we really want to focus on what can you do if your child is excluded from school. Um, I will start off by first explaining a little bit who I am and who Arch is, for those of you who may not be aware of us. And then I will really get into what is an exclusion? What does that mean to be excluded from school? And we'll spend a bit of time after that to really get through some tips and some general advice on what you should keep in mind or the steps you can take if you come across a situation where the school is excluding your child. So to start off, Arch Disability Law Center is a disability rights legal clinic. We are located in Toronto, Ontario. And Arch is dedicated to defending and advancing the equality rights, entitlements, fundamental freedoms, and inclusion of low-income persons with disabilities across Ontario. And Arch is primarily funded by Legal Aid Ontario. To sum up, we are a community legal clinic specialized in disability rights, and we do serve in the province of Ontario, so communities in Ontario specifically. Some of the services that we do provide to communities, persons with disabilities in Ontario include a free and confidential summary advice and referral service where we would essentially be providing legal advice to persons with disabilities in very specific disability area related areas of law. Um, we do not, unfortunately, practice in all areas of law. We do have a focus in certain areas of law, including education. So if a person with a disability in Ontario has an issue, in one of our practice areas, they can contact us and we could provide them with free and confidential summary legal advice. We also do provide legal representation in test cases. What is a test case? Really means it's a case that has the potential um, to bring a systemic change and a positive change for the rights of persons with disabilities in Ontario. So we do provide that representation in those kind of cases. Um, we also do, as Andrea mentioned, we also do a lot of public legal education presentations, just like we're doing tonight, um, and really to inform persons with disabilities of the rights that they have in different contexts and different areas of law. Um, and we also do some community development work and as well engage in law reform and policy work, which is more geared to, um, for example, making submissions or writing to the government, for example, to bring change, positive change for persons with disabilities straight to the government in that sense. And more specifically, as it relates to the topic at hand today, Arches also does run a what we call internally an exclusion clinic, which means that we do provide additional services if there is a student with disability in Ontario that has been excluded from their school. We do provide some assistance in terms of appealing that exclusion, which we'll talk about tonight. and also trying to advocate or help advocate for that student's return to school. So, as I've mentioned, because Arch is a legal clinic that is located in Ontario, and which means we do serve the province of Ontario. So most of my comments tonight about what the law says on exclusions is going to be mostly limited to Ontario laws. If you are attending this webinar from a different province, a lot of the information is still relevant, of course, just in terms of what laws would apply or specific laws. I will, maybe just when we get to that point, I could just make a mention of those more distinctions, basically, from other provinces. But generally speaking, all basic human rights principles, such as the rights of a student in school remains relatively, pretty much the same everywhere across the board, no matter the province. So, so what is an exclusion itself? So an exclusion is, when we talk about an exclusion, we're talking about the removal of a student from a school or a classroom by the school principal. Um, In Ontario, there is the Education Act of Ontario that mentions a form of exclusion. The Education Act itself uses the term or the expression refusal to admit. Um, and in the Education Act at Section 265(1)(m), really presents that a principal has the discretion to quote unquote refuse to admit a student for reasons of for safety concerns, whether that's concerns of safety for the student themselves or concerns of safety of other students. Um, and the Education Act also does state that there is a right of appeal, which we will talk about a bit more in detail later on tonight. Um, However, that's really where the law kind of stops in terms of what the Education Act says about exclusions or known also as refusal to admit. Um, and that can sometimes present a bit of an issue in terms of not having consistency of how schools are using this discretionary power to exclude a student, particularly a student with a disability. Um, there is some guidance that has ar that arose, from the Ministry of Education in Ontario, meaning that an exclusion should not be used to punish a student's behavior or, especially if it's disability related. But it's really about a concern for safety. The other thing that's different from an exclusion, which makes it even more so problematic, is that there's no stated time limits as to how long a student can be excluded from a school. And when a student is excluded, the definition states, like they are no longer in school at that point. There is still an obligation that they should be getting some form of education or instruction or work at home, homework from home, but it's not the same, obviously. And there is no time limit. So we've seen students being excluded for weeks, months, with no end in sight, right? Which is extremely, extremely problematic in many ways. Um, Now, I did mention already that exclusions are not supposed to be used to punish a student's behavior. It's not meant to be a disciplinary measure. there are suspensions and expulsions already in existence to deal with any form of discipline. However, we have seen this happen often that schools would use an exclusion measure to exclude a student kind of like as a disguised discipline measure, right? For any disability related behavior that occurs. So instead of the school, accommodating or addressing, whatever behavior is happening, they would basically exclude the student instead for something that they actually should be uh, that the school should be addressing or accommodating in some way. So, an exclusion itself can present itself in different ways. Um, we've seen, there is a more formal exclusion, which comes with, usually a decision letter from the school. There is generally appeal rights, or at least in Ontario, there's appeal rights attached to that kind of decision. And there is, most school boards would have a process regarding, okay, when a student is excluded, what happens next? However, what we see more often is these other forms of exclusions that are not really captured by any legislation per se, or at least not directly, and they're not even presented as an exclusion. But within the facts of the events or the series of what's going on, it's very clear that's an exclusion in terms of it's a removal of a student in the school. Um, so we do see, more informal forms of exclusions very often in schools, which can look like, a principal calling the parents saying, okay, actually, why don't you keep your child at home for the next couple of days. We had an incident, we need to figure things out. Why don't they stay at home for the next few days, for the next week or next month, or until after the holidays, or etc. Um, or, a parent gets called constantly throughout the day to come pick up their child because for some disability related behavior that's happening at school. Um, or they even say, okay, listen, why don't, not necessarily there was an incident that happened, but they would call the parent and say that, listen, there's not going to be enough staff for the next couple weeks because we're short staffed. So actually, your child can't come to school for the next few weeks because it's not safe, right? So all those are, seem, they're not using the term exclusion itself, but in reality, that's kind of what it is. It is a form of, the student is not allowed to go to school for whatever reason. And it's not necessarily, justified reasons. As we'll see tonight, there are different things that the school should do instead of or before, resorting to removing a student from a school. Um, and we've seen also what we kind of call partial exclusions. And here we're really talking about like shortened days, where, a child may only be quote unquote allowed to come to the school for a certain amount of hours, instead of a full day, because for whatever reason, the school is determined that it's not safe or there's not enough staff, there's not enough resources for the child to be there longer. Now, I do want to just mention one thing is that, especially with shortened days, there are situations where that is an accommodation, and that's fine if that's the accommodation that is needed for the student. That's one thing. But when it becomes a problem is when it's not an accommodation. It's not because of their disability related needs. It's actually a form to limit the student's time in school. That's when it kind of becomes a problem and gets really closer to an exclusion type. So why is this an issue? Well, really, because all students have a right to meaningful education. And meaningful access to meaningful education includes receiving the appropriate accommodations for their disability-related needs in order for them to access their education. It also includes the right to have like removal of barriers that may be present at the school, whether it's physical or attitudinal, the attitudes or any other types of barriers that would prevent a student with disability to access their education. And um, as part of the right to meaningful education includes the right to not be discriminated against when they are attending school. In Ontario, we do have the Ontario's Human Rights Code that really details, the the school or school board, I should say, obligation to accommodate students with disabilities in more details, as well as ensuring that they're not being discriminated against or being refused access to education because of their disability. And I'm confident that in many other provinces there is their own your own legislation that deals with these kind of more specific issues. Um, so in order to ensure that students have this right to meaningful education, as I mentioned, there is a need of having access to appropriate accommodations. And and with that in mind, students with disabilities essentially have a right to be accommodated at school up to the point of undue hardship. And this is really comes down to, you know, kind of it's kind of like somewhat limit to the duty to accommodate of a school. But however, with some little asterisks and fine print that we need to we will talk about. So essentially, the right to have appropriate accommodations for their disability related needs really comes down to, figuring out what does the student need in order to have meaningful access to education, right, at the school. What is it that they need? Is it some staff resources? Is it equipment? Is it the change in the curriculum or modifications in the curriculum? Um, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the types of accommodations that could be possible is just as many as how many students there are, right? Every student has very individualized needs. And the schools have to really respect those individualized needs and make an individual assessment of what each student with disability, what their needs are specifically. Now, when we talk about that there's this accommodation due to accommodate up to the point of undue hardship. Undue hardship, it really goes to essentially cost um, with a consideration of any outside sources of funding and also health and safety concerns. So when we talk about cost, which is one excuse that we hear often from schools. We're not talking about that's going to cost them a couple dollars or whatever. We're really talking about like this is excessive cost that really will go basically to the heart of their budget. Um, it's it's not just there has to be some cost. If there's costs involved, they have to cover that, no doubt about it. But when it says to the fact of it being undue hardship due to cost, they really have to demonstrate that it's uh, so in excess to what they can afford that would essentially bring them down at that point, right? And when they're assessing the cost, they actually have to consider whether there's outside source of funding available. There are many programs across, across the province, across the country that would provide some funding, in these kind of situations. And the schools have to, if that's something that could help to finance or pay for a particular accommodation that is needed by the student, then the school has to explore that. Otherwise, they can't claim that they can't afford it, right? Because they haven't really explored all of the options. And then there's the health and safety concerns. If there is an accommodation or accommodating the student or the accommodation itself poses health and safety concerns, then that may reach the point of undue hardship. Now, I do need to maybe just specify one thing because we have been hearing this a few times, at least recently, from schools and school boards, that are claiming undue hardship because the student themselves are causing safety concerns or health and safety concerns. However, that is not what the test is, right? So if your school is telling you, well, we can't accommodate your child because they are causing health or safety concerns, it's not the student that would be causing undue hardship, it's the accommodation itself. If the student needs to be accommodated, maybe there is safety concerns in terms of, for example, the student elopes at times or something like that. Like there are safety concerns in place. Well, then they need to accommodate or put in place resources or a system or a plan itself in order to eliminate that concern. But um, but really, it really comes down to whether or not, the accommodation or accommodating itself would cause health and safety concerns. And that is really where Section 265(1)(m) in Ontario, or exclusions more generally, that's really where it kind of goes to, right? It kind of like links in together with the duty to accommodate and this idea of excluding students um, due to perceived or actual safety concerns that may be present. Now, it is because of the right of students to have access to meaningful education, um, and their right to be accommodated and to receive the appropriate accommodations. A school cannot just exclude the student for the discriminatory reasons, and that includes based on disability. And what I mean by that is essentially, they can't decide to exclude a student because they have a disability, right? Or because of their disability-related behavior. And I did talk a little bit about this earlier, but I think it's very important to continue to stress that because we have seen that exclusions is used very, very often because of or that's related to a student's disability-related behavior. And the argument there is generally, well, you can't you can't use their disability in order to as a reason to exclude them or to remove them from school. That's so directly discrimination. Um, You can't get any more direct discrimination than that. And the other thing to mention is that an exclusion itself cannot be used to excuse or discharge the school's duty to accommodate. So the school, I mentioned this a few times, but the school has this duty to accommodate. There is an accommodation process that many of you may be already very familiar with in terms of um, getting through and figuring out what the accommodations that should be provided to the student. What does the student need in order to access their education? What are the students' disability-related needs? And really investigating what are the accommodations that should be in place and actually implementing those accommodations once those are identified. So what an exclusion cannot do is that the school cannot decide to exclude a student solely in order to not go through their obligations under human rights laws in order to accommodate the student. And what that could look like, if I could just give you an example to really understand what we mean by this, is that, if there's a student with disability needs some accommodations in terms of let's say accommodation in terms of they need a support person or an EA in class. And the school, instead of investigating that need or looking into providing that EA to the student, decide, well, you know what? If they need an EA, then we can't, we're not going to investigate what we're going to do. We're not going to look into it. We're not going to, try to figure out what we could do for the student. What we're going to do instead, we're going to decide that it's not safe for them to be in school. So they're going to be removed from school. And and that's kind of like trying to work around their human rights obligations here, right? By simply deciding that, the student, instead of accommodating them, they're going to remove them from the school. And that is something that an exclusion cannot be used as. So now that we got a good understanding, or at least a general understanding of what an exclusion could be, what it should not be, what happens if the principal at your school decides to exclude your child? What does that look like? What do you do? Um, Now for the next few slides, I am going to give you more general information about what you can do or what some tips and things that could apply across the board in terms of guidance. And there are some areas I may just specify whether that's Ontario specific in terms of specific steps, but anything else is really more general for everyone to really keep in mind. So many times the school will generally verbally tell the parent their child is excluded from school. And And that doesn't necessarily mean that would be in an email or a formal letter, right? They're just going to say either in person, on the phone, over Zoom. However, inform the parent that, listen, your child is excluded from school. And it's important to be kind of in tune because the principal or whoever is calling you from the school may not necessarily use the word exclusion or excluded. It may be disguised differently because, as I've mentioned a bit earlier, there is some situations um, where we're looking at more formal exclusions, where the term exclusion may be more so used, but more often than not, we're talking about informal exclusions, where it's almost like schools are careful not to use that word, right? In order to kind of disguise it and soften, the blow in a way. Um, and they may use, different kinds of expressions or different types of words, such as, let me tell you, listen, maybe don't bring your child to school for the next few days, few weeks, for the next little while. We need to figure things out. But it's best that they stay home. There was XYZ that happened today. So why don't your child stay home for some time until we figure out what's the best next step, right? And that could last, weeks or months. And all they're doing is kind of like stringing you along. Um, but essentially, when it comes down to it, those are decisions to exclude a child from school. Um, could also be something that we've heard also principals use. Maybe your child should not be going at this school anymore, but maybe they could go to a different school, um, in a different area. It's a better fit for them, or this school is not a good fit for them. Or we don't have the resources here at this school, which is generally the home school of the child, of the student, and they're really trying to push you to go to this other school. Um, Again, these are all kind of some ways for principals and or vice principals sometimes to really exclude a student without officially excluding a student, which because these are more informal exclusions, I would call them. It is a lot harder as well to track in terms of how many times it's happening. But I can say that, just in our experience at Arch, like we hear these very, very often, like more so these kind of quote unquote informal exclusions, um, more so than the more formal exclusions where there is an actual letter that is written, there's an appeal that would happen, and there's a whole process behind it. Um, so when the school kind of, gives you these clues or you believe that what they're telling you may be a form of exclusion, one thing to maybe ask for is really to ask them to confirm flat out. Are you making this, are you deciding to exclude my child from the school? Because are you telling them they're not allowed to come to this school? Right? To just see, to really confirm that and really put it out there, that that this is not just a soft way to be figuring out what to do, that there is repercussions to their action, that they know that there's repercussions to their actions, and that they need to make sure that if they are deciding to tell you that your child cannot come to school, that they need to really confirm that this is an exclusion. And then at that point, you could take the next step. Um, and I do always, stress this, um, to ask for this decision, or, this instruction from the school, to ask for it in writing. Ask them to put this in writing and to tell you the reasons in writing for the decision that they made. Why can't you bring your child to school for the next few days, weeks, or months? Why does your child cannot come to this school any longer? And they want you to switch them to a different school somewhere else. That's not the home school. Um, and it's really important because one, it help, it could it could, the best case scenario, make them rethink, what they're doing because they're like, well, this may be a bit too drastic. Um, or two, it would give you something to really take and then from there figure out what your next step is in terms of what you can do regarding the school's decision. And it could also having a something in writing could also help you determine if there is an appeal that could be possible in this situation, depending on the reasons, depending also on, the decision that's made. Um, and if so, it would also have to include some way of explaining, what is the appeal process? How can you fight that decision? How can you get it reversed? And are there timelines for it as well for that appeal? Um, and that may also all be described in the letter of decision that they would provide you. But as well, it is every school board should have some form of a policy on exclusions themselves, which really details, in general terms, like what is the appeal process? In what circumstances can a school exclude a student? Um, I talked about, the appeal process, the deadline. How do you appeal a decision like this? Um, what is the timeline to submit evidence? Is there in front of a hearing, before a hearing, if there is a hearing that is in place, or is it some other form of appeal, whether um, it's just writing to the board of trustees or writing to, another department in the school board. How does that look like? So every school board has those kind of policies. Um, Now I should say, especially in Ontario, so every school board has a policy that talks about exclusions. Not every school board, sorry, has a a comprehensive policy on exclusions, which what I mean by that is not every school board necessarily has a detailed policy on exclusion, or a detailed process. Some of them do, many of them don't. They just have, a policy that says exclusions are under the Education Act. There's a right of appeal, um, and they kind of leave it at that. While as other school boards, it's a lot more detailed. They go through, okay, well, this is the timeline, this is the deadline if a parent wants to appeal it. This is what the school has to prove. This is what the parent has to prove. This is the process. We're going to have a panel of this amount of people. Like it's very detailed. So it does vary. The process itself does vary from school board to school board. And because it varies from school board to school board, it's even more important for you to ask for a copy of this policy. If you're if there is if you can confirm that this is an exclusion, then ask for a copy of the policy so that you can review it and you can actually know what the process is for your particular school and school board. Because like I said, they vary from one school board to another. As opposed to other forms of appeals or measures like suspensions and expulsions, which are generally, pretty um they're pretty consistent across the board because it's essentially it's essentially legislated that a specific process. Whereas exclusions, it's really left to discretion of the schools as to when to exclude, and it's left to the school board's discretion as to how they're going to deal with the situation where there is a decision to exclude and the parent wants to appeal it. So, so yes, so very important to ask for a copy of this policy. So let's say that you confirm that either this is a formal exclusion where your child is formally excluded, because a school is claiming that there's a safety concern, either a safety concern regarding towards your child specifically, or a safety concern about your child towards other students. Or I should also say sometimes the schools go as far as to say, as to claim that's a safety concern for the teachers, which legally speaking should not fall under, and does not fall under the definition of exclusion, or at least that's what we would argue time and time again. Because at least in Ontario, the Education Act is clear is about concerns towards peers and not staff. But that may be a discussion as well for more detail for another day, but that is something to also keep in mind itself. So if there is a formal exclusion, or even if it's not a formal exclusion, right? Even in situations where there is no formal decision, they're just saying, listen, we just need to figure out something, a new plan, and we just need a few days or a few weeks to figure that out. And that's more of on the informal side, informal exclusion. There should always be, or generally, some form of a plan to return the child to school, whether that's through the school, whether that's with the school board, or whether that's your own plan, right? That, like, if the school is not proposing a plan, although I would argue that they should be the ones that are making that plan and not just excluding forever to never think about the child going back to school. But I also do understand that it does happen very often. I've seen it happen very often that, the school is not even interested in talking about it. However, there should be some form of discussions or some form of return to school. Now, one thing what I would say is that those kind of discussions to what is needed to have the child your child go back to the school, either to that school. There may be situations where maybe it's more appropriate for it to be in a different school, and so I won't say necessarily that's always bad to go to transition to a different school or stay at the same school, because every situation is very, very individualized with its own, specific situations. Um, but let's say, there is a plan, or there is or you are looking to have your child go back to the same school, right? Despite, whatever concerns or alleged concerns, I should say, from the school, whatever they have. One thing I think is very important to do for you as a parent to really get, the full understanding. If you haven't already done so, review your child's current accommodation plan with the school. If they have a safety plan or behavioral plan, review those as well. There may be situations where the child is not properly accommodated. So that needs to be part of the return to school plan, or at least part of the discussions. Like there needs to be an update to these plans, these accommodation plan, safety plans, behavior plan, if any exist. Um, Now, more often than not, there is an alleged incident. I won't say that incident itself because a lot of times, may or may not have happened, but the principal would use some incident or some alleged incident to justify, excluding your child. Um, and if that's the case, if that is um, their justification for their decision, then you should have, some details about what happened or what is alleged to have happened, I should say. So review those, and so that it could really come down to what exactly what is true, what is not true, and that could be the starting point as well in terms of determining whether that was a just decision or not. Is if there is any incident reports, if there was an alleged incident, of course there should be an incident report, but ask for a copy of it, so that you could really review exactly what's been going on. And I mentioned this earlier that a lot of times, or it should be the school that proposes a plan for your child to return to school after they've been excluded. And that could look like either, okay, well, before they could come back to school, they have to do an assessment. We have to review their safety plan. We have to get in, XYZ resources in place first, whatever it is that they call it, they could sometimes call it like conditions for your child to go back to the school. So they would normally detail that in the decision letter as well. So review that and see what it is that they are actually wanting as a condition. And I'm not saying that it needs to be accepted as what you need to follow, but at least you know where they are at, and then you'll be in a better position to really discuss um, what exactly should be the plan itself. So as you know, once a student is they decide to exclude a student, um, the school really should be coming forward with really wanting to discuss a return to school, or the school board perhaps as well would be involved, a return to school plan as soon as possible, right? There is no need to, wait weeks or months. I mean, this is, those weeks and months are times that the child is not um, accessing any education, right? Or very limited education, which is not appropriate at all. Um, so um, so really there should be some meetings uh that should be scheduled, or at least some discussion should be happening about, getting the child's back to school. This should be initiated by either the school or the school board. But there are times where it may not be. Um, so in any event, um, and I know, a lot of things, a lot of times it may be very, very frustrating to deal with the administration at schools or deal with members of the school board. But it's important to keep the communication lines open with the school and school boards. Um, it's not necessarily the time to shut down and ignore them, because that could just make it go like take longer for it to resolve. Um, if the school is scheduling meetings to discuss, the return to school plan, attend those meetings. Or if they're not talking about, then really request them, and request them in writing. That you want to meet to discuss this decision. You want to meet to discuss, when can your child go back to be back in school? We need to get them back in school as soon as possible. Um, you know, those are really important to really get to the heart as to how did we get there? Why is the school making this decision? What is behind, is it an issue? Are they claiming that the accommodation plan is not working? Then fine, then that needs to be discussed, right? Are there more appropriate accommodations that should be put in place, for instance? So, and with that in mind, that brings me to my next point, that at those meetings, to really discuss your child's accommodations and strategies that are currently in place at school, and if there are any changes that are needed to the plans. Important to also discuss this openly. It's not time to sugarcoat. Something's not working, something is not working. If they have to put more resources, then they need to know that it's on them to do this. And when discussing the return to school plan, this also includes, talking about what are the timelines, right? It's one thing to be, yeah, sure, sure, we're going to make sure your child is going back to school. We're gonna, look into whether or not, we could get an extra EA, for example, or more, or this type of technology or that type of resource or support. That's all very vague. Doesn't tell you anything about the plan. So it is important to get the details of this plan, including timelines. How long is it going to take? How long is it from step one to step two, right? They may not be able to tell you all the timelines because maybe some steps, when they'll happen, depends on other factors, but you should have a rough idea. Like, okay, let's check in 2 weeks or let's check in a week, where we're at, in terms of let's have another meeting, right? It's really about, again, going back to my first point, keeping the communications open with the school. Well, the school also has that, should be keeping the communications open with you. Um, Depending on how long your child has been excluded, there may be additionally a transition plan that now needs to be put in place, um, because they have to transition back into school, which is something that also needs to be thoroughly discussed with the school. Depending on how long, depending on, the student's needs and things like that. Um, so all those things really need to be discussed openly. And I should also mention that, because we hear this a lot from parents about whether or not they can bring someone or bring support persons or anyone with them to these meetings with the school. And of course, I would always say like, yes, please do. I mean, you are allowed to bring your support people that are also working with your child to get a better understanding of the situation. Like, really think of this as a team, right? Bring your team basically to these meetings. Um, I haven't, or I can't remember the last time I heard a school board or a school saying no to a parent bringing someone who's part of the team that is assisting, the student, right? That's brought in by the parent or that's acting as a support person. Because the point of these meetings is to try to come to solution, right? Come across to a solution in order with the main goal to eliminate the exclusion and and have the student return to school as soon as possible. And that is really what's important in these kind of meetings. Now, just a little bit more of a simpler way, because I know I've talked a lot about different aspects of what could happen, what should happen. But if I could break it down into a couple steps. Essentially, if your child is excluded or the school is actually says in some way or another that your child is excluded, ask for a decision in writing. Okay, that's the first step. This will confirm that your child is being excluded. It will give you the reasons for the exclusion. Why is your child being removed from the school? It could also detail the next steps or basically the plan to get your child back into school. That's being proposed by the school, I should say. Not necessarily that is the actual correct plan, or next steps, but what's being proposed by the school. And it would provide as well instructions on what the appeal process is, um, if assuming that it's a formal exclusion itself. Um, so so that would be the first step, right? If we would summarize everything I just said right now, it's that. Second step would be to actually appeal the exclusion decision. And this comes really from, the fact of there is rights of appeal, to appeal decisions to exclude. every school board has a different appeal process in place, so important to really check what is the appeal process for your school board. Um, and that's where you would really ask for a copy of the policy that talks about exclusions. And and that process, that appeal process can also include the way, like in what way can you appeal a decision? Is it through a letter and to who that letter is addressed? Is there a specific form that the school board uses? Where can you find that form? Et cetera, et cetera. But generally speaking, to be honest, for the most part, it's really just a letter that's sent to the school itself. That basically what you would need to do is just explain in the letter why you disagree with the decision. And from that point on, there would be a formal appeal process that would be initiated. Um, like I said there many times, there it is different from school board to school board, but most of the time, or maybe I would say 90% of the time, or something around that, the appeal process itself involves a hearing, usually in front of the Board of Trustees, um, whether that's a panel of several members, several trustees, or a panel of two or three trustees only. That depends on your school board, of course. Um, where at that moment you would then be able to present why you disagree with the school's decision, and the school will be there to defend their decision. And then this panel from the board of trustees will then be in a position to they'll listen to both sides and make a decision about whether or not the decision to exclude the student is upheld or not. Now, um, between the time that you would appeal the decision, and the time that there's a hearing of the appeal, like really, there could be some several weeks or even some cases months in between those two events. And a lot of times there is some meetings that happen with the school board and you and the parents, which brings us back to what I just mentioned about attending meetings with the school or school boards. So, just because you're appealing a decision does not mean that discussions or meetings will be stopped with the school. They will still continue, and as they should, because if there's a way to resolve this without having to go to a hearing, even better, because that'll resolve it a lot quicker. But at least it's important to still appeal the decision as soon as you get it, because some or many school boards have very, very, very tight deadlines to appeal these kind of decisions. I've seen as small as 5 days, and as long as a couple weeks or a month, but it could be just a few days too. So it's really important to really get that in place or get that appeal in as soon as possible. Now, these steps are really more specific to formal exclusions. I do get that. I mean, if it's a formal exclusion, there is a right to appeal. However, if it's not a formal exclusion, meaning, they're not saying the school is just basically saying, no, 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 we're not excluding formally, we're not engaging in, the actual process to exclude. We just need a few days or et cetera, or whatever reason they want to give. It's still important for you to make your concerns heard in writing, preferably, and to kind of have, they want to make an informal exclusion, then have an informal appeal meeting in a way, right? To really discuss what is the problem? Why are you removing my child from school even for a few days? Like, explain to me this, because we don't agree This is my concerns. And if it's an issue of accommodations, then let's talk about that. If the issue is that there needs to be other supports in place, then let's talk about that instead of completely removing the child from school. Um, so so more generally, it's important to keep copies of any documents, emails, letters that you have sent to the school or school board or that they have sent to you. Always keep those aside just, for your records, just in case. Um, it's important to also try to keep note of the timeline of events that occurred leading up to the exclusion. Was there any alleged incidents at school? One or several? Um, you know, w Make notes of the dates of those alleged incidents and what happened. Um, or if there was any calls that were made with the school, or the school called you to tell you to come pick up your child, for whatever reason. Make notes of those dates and what happened, what was the reason that they gave you. Because as we are all aware, like as much as I could tell everyone have everything done in writing, the reality is in practice, it obviously doesn't always happen that way, right? A lot of times it's school, it's phone calls. A lot of times it's when you go to pick your child up. That's when discussions happen. But try to keep note of all that as much as possible, just so that then you have a good timeline of exactly when everything occurred. When did you request accommodations or a meeting? Um, when did you have a meeting with the school, right? What dates were there? What was discussed, generally speaking? What was this discussions about during those meetings? Were there documents that you requested or they requested and you shared with them? When were they requested or shared? What was those documents, right? Etc. Really like keeping a timeline of really your interactions with the school. Um, and during meetings or phone calls with the school or school board, try to also take notes, or keep some notes at least either during the meeting or immediately after, so you have a record of what was said during those meetings or calls. And whenever you have any meetings with the school or um, or discussions with the school about how your child's doing, if there is like some discussion that they want to discuss, related to um, incidents or related to accommodation plans or related to, possible exclusions or shortening the days, whatever it is, right? At the end of the meetings, just always try to confirm what the next steps are in writing. So what I mean by that is that after the meeting, for example, send them a quick email saying, okay, we've talked about this, and we agreed that you, school, are going to do this, or I will provide you this, right? So that everyone's on the same page. Um, and no one gets confused as to or forgets, particularly the school doesn't forget what they have to do or what their next steps are. And as always, get legal advice. You could get legal advice at any stage, even if you're not sure of what your next step should be. If you're not sure if it's an exclusion or not, get some legal advice. So if you are in Ontario, you can contact Arch for summary legal advice about, what your rights are, what your child's rights are. I mean, in this situation, what steps you can do. For those of you who are not in Ontario, I would suggest, seek legal advice to a lawyer that practices in education law in your province. Because it is really important. I'm giving you all this general information, but of course, there's always the more specific details that could be, more specific advice that could be helpful for your specific situation. And As well, in addition to our legal services that Arch provides, we also do have on our website a general guide for students, just generally about human rights and education in Ontario. And we also have an advocacy toolkit specifically for whenever, if, or I shouldn't say whenever, if your child is excluded. We have some template letters in there as well that you could use or tailor to what your needs are. And I'm open to any questions that may come up. And thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lila. That was so informative. I took a lot of notes myself. I learned a lot, and I see we have a lot of questions. So,
Okay.
what I'll do is I'll just ask them, and we'll get through as many as we can. So, the other thing too is people are asking if the webinar will be shared, and that is our intention. So, um, that should come out. But so starting with the first question, is it an exclusion for the principal to decide to remove a student from their community school to be placed in a different school?
Yes, that would be a form of exclusion. And it is a common one that we see happen, right? And, that's usually done through the school board. But the principal can absolutely decide to, for whatever reason, decide that the student is removed from their community school, from their home school, and it's better to be at another school. That is a form of exclusion, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Are safety plans in the Education Act? Who writes them? Should caregivers be involved in them? Safety seems to be the new loophole to justify exclusions.
Yeah, absolutely. They are the loophole to justify exclusions. Um, and safety plans, I mean, they are created by the school in the same way as IEPs are, and other forms of accommodation plan that may happen, that may be in place. And however, like it's not necessarily just a school that would be the only ones involved. Parents, caregivers should also be involved in that process, the same way that they're involved to some extent in the IEP process, right? In determining what is appropriate for the student in terms of what the safety plan is. Now, what generally happens, though, and what we see more often happening, is that the school would draft a safety plan already and then just give it to the parent and say, approve this, right? But you have a right to look that over and review it and ask questions and ask for it to be edited if it's not appropriate, right?
Okay. The next one, can a school board expect the family to fund the accommodation? For example, funding for supports from an outside agency through OAP.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. We definitely hear that one a lot too. So the short answer is it's not on the students or the parents to fund accommodations that are occurring in the school, right? The school and the school board have a duty to accommodate the student. That duty to accommodate is a legal obligation. And it includes, that they have the responsibility to pay for the accommodation itself. Now, having said that, I do want to just mention, not necessarily about the OAP funding specifically, but just in general, if there is, um, you know, if there are programs out there available, like through government or nonprofit organizations that would fund or would help fund, a resource for a student, the school board does have the obligation as well um, to reach out to that program directly, not through the cost of not through the cost of the parent, like really a separate thing, right? To get funding, and this is what we call like outside sources of funding, right? In addition to their budget. So that's a bit of a two-parter, I guess, for that question. I hope it answers that question.
Okay, thank you. If a school is suggesting a child should go to a special class at another school, what kinds of questions should we ask?
Hmm. Well, one, I guess the main question would be, what is a special class?
Yeah.
Right? What does that mean? And is this a placement um, decision? Right? Is that a change in their placement? When I hear special class, I hear segregated class, right? And whether or not that's what that means, I don't know. I guess that's why the first question is, what is the special class? But if it is, then are we looking at change of placement, right? Are they supposed to be in a regular classroom with supports? Or are they now, and they're now being placed in a segregated classroom? I think that needs to be thoroughly discussed with the school as to why they need to be going to, one, why they need to go into the special class at a different school, and also why do they need to change school, right? And from there, get to know the why of it, and then that'll tell you what your next step would be, right? If the reason for it is that, well, there's not enough resources at this school, et cetera, et cetera. There's safety concerns here, then we're talking about an exclusion, right? Is it, actually, I can't really think of any other reasons, but um, there might be other reasons. I can't think of any right now. I guess it just would be an exclusion from that school, and they're kind of like pushing them to another school, right? So really, the first question is, what is this special class? Second question is, why do they have to go to this special class? And third question is, why do they have to move school to attend this class or any other class? Why can't they stay in the same school?
Okay. The next question is a two-part question. So, should the reentry plan not include the parents' input and be agreed upon by the parents? What if they disagree?
Yeah, a lot of times the proposed plan um, does not have input from the parents, at least at the beginning. The school just kind of puts this out to the parent and say, this is what it is. You want your kid back in school, they have to follow these conditions or they have to follow this plan. Now, that's usually how it starts. However, of course, you don't have to agree to anything, right? There's no one that says you have to agree. What I would suggest that in that situation to do is really have us just tell the school, listen, we have to meet. I want to discuss this plan because I have lots of concerns. And at that meeting, really tell them all your concerns about it and have that open discussion with them as to why you are concerned and what needs to change in the plan. And you know, uh, I can't say it happens all the time, but many times, the schools can be open to tweaking the plan. At the very least, they'll meet with you and talk about your concerns. Um, and some clarification either on the plan could happen or some edits to the plan could happen, right? Could be one or the other. But those discussions, has to have to happen. So you have to have a good schedule a meeting with them, with the school to really go through that plan. Um, and nothing will happen until you consent, right? Until you agree to it. So, so important to really, get into, and it may take more than one meeting. I'm not here to say that one meeting will solve everything. It may take more than one. Maybe there's more information that is needed to clarify exactly what does this plan mean? What are the supports you're looking for, et cetera, et cetera. So, be open to attending those meetings and be open to actually telling the school what your concerns are.
Okay. There's a lot of questions actually about. So the questions are growing as we're talking.
Oh.
But there's a lot of questions about incident reports. So I'm going to there's two back to back, so they're different people. But the first one is, what can a parent do when the school states they do not have to give copies of incident reports to families? And then, sort of further to that, it's that parents are being told that incident reports can't be shared because it involves other students or teachers.
Hmm.
So it's sort
Hmm.
of there, and there's quite a few questions along those lines.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's the age-old question of them trying to say there's nothing there, right? Or they're trying to say they can't share anything. Um, there is the one thing, if they're refusing, I would say escalate your complaint. If the school principal is saying we can't provide it to you, then talk to the superintendent. Because while there are situations, fine, maybe, you don't want to involve other students or you don't want, to disclose some information about other students, there are ways to black out information that may be viewed as confidential, if that is the case. However, what I would always argue is that, you're basing a decision to exclude my child based on this incident report. Um, and you're not even letting us actually view or review the incident report itself. And that's where the appeal itself would actually be really, really helpful because that's information they have to disclose, right? They have to, at the very least, they have to disclose it to the board of trustees, right? Through the appeal. Like it's evidence to say this is what happened. So through like appealing it, if it is a formal exclusion, through the process of appealing it, then that will give you the report itself. If they exist, because we have also heard situations where they claim there's an incident report and it never shows up.
Hmm.
It never existed. But if it does exist and they are refusing, then yeah, the first thing I would do is really escalate this to the superintendent saying they're claiming that there's an incident. I cannot get a hold of the incident reports, and try to get them to get involved to release that to you.
Okay, so building on that, the next two questions are also about incident reports. So specifically is one a child on the autism spectrum disorder or with autism spectrum disorder who has limited verbal skills. So the parents are not always clear from their child what's going on. And they've also been told they can't receive them. Um, oh, so it's the same question. Is it true? And I think you've answered that. Okay, so it is not true that they
Hmm.
can. Yeah. The next one then is parents are being told they need to go through FIPPA in order to get the incident report. Any insights or thoughts about the school also using police in safety plans? So that's two
Mhm.
questions. So the first one about the incident report.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have heard that that does happen sometimes that they have to make a FIPA request to get as a report. And that's really, whether that could be viewed as a delay tactic or not. A FIPA request, I mean, it generally starts off by making a request to the school board. So I don't know how different really it is than
Yeah.
just asking the school board, other than maybe going to a specific department itself. But I mean, that situation, that's just a process that some school boards have adopted, in terms of disclosing that kind of information or those kind of reports. But I would still argue it, to be honest, that, this is information about your own child, right? If the concern is privacy, of other people involved, then that makes a bit more sense to go through that kind of process. But, you know, anything that occurs, um, related to your child, you should have the right to review that without any barriers in place.
Okay. There's a
Um,
little more to the question about the police there. Sorry, I missed that.
oh, okay.
Yeah, so any thoughts about school using police and safety plans and the example? For example, if the child is unable to return to a regulated state, that the police would be called. In some instances, police are directed to escort the child to a mental health facility for an assessment.
Wow. Um, that is extreme, to say the least, of one kind of safety plan. But I do understand, that it is something that schools try to put in. Um, you know, it is it is a major issue with schools involving the police when dealing with a student with disability. Um, it is a major concern in many respects, for sure, including, the impact that that has, if the police are called, the impact that that has on the student. Um, this kind of goes back a little bit to the earlier question about, approving a safety plan. And this is one of the things that I would strongly suggest that this is addressed as a major concern. Like, why do we need to go that far? Like, that is a very extreme situation, over policing, right, of people with disabilities from for disability related behavior. Um, that, if there is a trigger in place that occurs, for example, and the school is not properly dealing with that trigger, um, then that's on the school in terms of not having the correct resources in place, right? And the solution is not to send them to get the police involved and send them to a mental health facility, right? For an assessment, or whatever it is that they would do there. Um, but it's really a discussion about, well, that is way too extreme. That is not appropriate for a student to go through in any circumstances, and that they need to change that strategy. Now, um, there is this new legislation that just passed about a couple months ago, or the end of November, that does talk as well about bringing, some programs involving police back in school. And so there's some also talks about regulations um, that are being drafted regarding the use of police officers in schools. So I don't know if that will also impact um, this kind of, or the answer to this question. Because that's something, I think they're currently drafting some draft regulations, or some new regulations in Ontario about that. So we're just really watching that closely. But that may also, affect whether or not, schools will continue on that track of including police officers, or more schools will continue to will include police officers in safety plans. But for right now, my answer to that is that one, like, I've never heard of any situation where that would be an appropriate response in a safety plan. And that should be something that, as a parent, that to really stand firm into, like, this is not appropriate. You need to find a better strategy in place for in terms of the student's safety plan.
Thanks. Thank you, Lila. So I do am aware we're at the time. There maybe we could squeeze one question in because it does address, like, there's a whole bunch on this issue, and then we can wrap it up. Um, this is a very common question in here, is to do with staffing. So here's one from Saskatchewan. The main reasoning kids in Saskatchewan are receiving for being excluded is due to funding and a shortage of support staff. What's the main argument that can be made against this from parents or advocates, as it has nothing to do with the child and no particular incident happened for them to be excluded? And there's quite a few questions where families are told they can never have full-time attendance because of staffing shortage.
Hmm. Yeah, that is something we also hear a lot. Especially, towards the end of the semester of the year, sorry. May, June, where that comes up a lot, as well. And I mean, it really comes down to that one point as well that I made earlier in the presentation, was that schools should not use exclusion to circumvent their duty to accommodate, right? They have a legal obligation to accommodate the student, and that includes providing the resources or the staff that the student needs. Um, and to exclude them because there is no staff is to exclude them because the school is refusing to accommodate them, or trying to circumvent or not go through an accommodation process during that time period, that whatever they're mentioning, that there's not enough staff. Um, 'Cause if in fact, let's say for argument's sake, that there is in fact a shortage of staff, which I'm not saying there is or there isn't, but let's just say there is. Um, the solution should never be to exclude the child. The solution should be, okay, well, they need this. We can provide the like maybe less than, but to kind of add to that, or to make sure that their needs are all the students' needs are respected and they're fulfilled, then we will have to do additional accommodations, right? Some alternative accommodations in place, but excluding the child is not an alternative accommodation. It's just a matter to basically try to avoid their legal obligations. And that is what the argument would be. Like, well, if you're excluding because of a shortage of staff, then that is not because of safety. That is not a justification. And actually, we need to actually engage in your legal obligation to accommodate the student. And that means if, we need to talk about what the supports are that are in place, what can be provided, what should be provided, and how that's going to be provided.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you. Yeah, that's a really common issue or a common
it
um,
is. Yeah.
reason families are given. So I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Most of all, I'd like to thank Lila for her expertise and insight. Lots of complicated situations and questions, and hopefully this provided families with some clarity. And I can see from the numbers we had tonight that this was much needed and so many great questions. So thank you everyone for coming out. And on behalf of Inclusive Education Canada, thank you, Lila, for spending this time with us tonight. Very, very helpful.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night, everyone.